Hey guys, tonight we're stepping onto a platform that smells faintly of coal smoke, wool, and boiled milk. The air trembles as a steam locomotive sighs beside you, its brass fittings gleaming under gaslight. You can almost taste the soot, sharp, metallic, a hint of yesterday's rain. You're holding your ticket with slightly clammy fingers, and behind you, an impatient porter huffs, balancing an absurd pyramid of luggage topped by someone's velvet hatbox. You're heading into the Edwardian age, the brief, lavish pause between Victorian stiffness and the chaos of modernity, and you're about to discover why every self-respecting rail passenger insisted on carrying a miniature tea set. You probably won't survive this journey without one. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The train jolts to life, and with it, the great machine of Edwardian society rattles along its rails. You settle into a first-class compartment, or, if we're being honest, a second-class one that smells faintly of other people's sandwiches, and glance around. Opposite you, a gentleman unfurls a small leather case. Inside it, like some sacred relic of civilization, sits a delicate porcelain teacup, a tiny silver kettle, and a collapsible spirit burner that looks like it could double as a device for summoning demons. He nods to you with polite self-assurance, the kind that says, "Yes, I am about to make tea at 30 miles per hour, and no, I will not spill a drop." Because this isn't just caffeine. This is ritual armor. In an age obsessed with poise and propriety, tea is the last bastion of control. Trains were new, noisy, unpredictable beasts that hurled people across the countryside at unholy speeds, 40, even 50 miles an hour. Imagine it, the landscape spinning faster than any horse could gallop, your body vibrating from the tracks, your hat threatening to become airborne, and your soul quietly wondering whether humanity should have stopped with the stagecoach. Yet amid all that chaos, the British heart whispered, "At least let there be tea." Mainstream historians love to note that the Edwardian era, roughly 1901 to 1914, was a golden age of comfort and invention. You had electric lights flickering beside, oil lamps, women's suffrage simmering beside empire, and rail travel transforming from a grimy necessity into an elegant adventure. But what's less often said is how utterly dependent that transformation was on the cult of tea. It wasn't enough to have a seat. You needed grace. It wasn't enough to travel. You needed ceremony. That's where your miniature tea set came in. Picture it, a polished wooden box no bigger than a shoebox, lined with velvet. Inside, tiny cups, saucers, a sugar pot, maybe a teeny-tinned container of Assam or Darjeeling, and the pride of it all, a spirit kettle small enough to fit in your palm. These were portable shrines to composure. You could be hurtling through rain-soaked Yorkshire, your compartment swaying like a drunk walrus, and yet, if you had your tea set, you were, at least in spirit, unshaken. Quirky historians love to point out that the obsession with portable tea reached comic levels. There were tea-making kits disguised as handbags, kettles with built-in thermometers, even a patent for a railway cup stabilizer, essentially a saucer with a rubber rim to prevent sloshing. Some aristocratic families had custom sets engraved, with their coat of arms and the phrase semper calidus, Latin for always hot, because nothing says dignity like the ability to scald yourself in 3 languages. Still, there was method in this madness. Railway travel in the early 1900s wasn't the polished affair you might imagine from romantic postcards. Compartments were often drafty, refreshment rooms unpredictable, and train schedules flexible. You could find yourself stranded for hours on a rural siding, the only sustenance a stale ham roll and the frost forming on your mustache. The portable tea set wasn't an indulgence. It was survival gear for the genteel. And beyond survival, it was performance. Every pour was choreography. The measured clink of porcelain against saucer, the steadying of the cup in a trembling carriage, the deliberate pause before adding sugar, each gesture whispered refinement. To drink tea calmly while the industrial age howled around you was to declare mastery over modernity itself. But not everyone was convinced. Some critics in the press mocked what they called locomotive luncheons. One letter to the Times complained of a lady who endeavored to brew in the compartment, the ensuing fumes of methylated spirits rendering travel insupportable. Another traveler wrote that he'd seen a duel of kettles break out between rival matrons on a line to Brighton. Historians still argue whether this tea mania was a charming eccentricity or a national nervous disorder. Was it genuine? Devotion to comfort? Or just fear disguised as etiquette? After all, the Edwardians were clinging to ceremony, while the world changed faster than ever before. Cars were honking in the streets, telephones ringing in drawing rooms, and airplanes buzzing like enormous mosquitoes overhead. The tea set, in its polished absurdity, was a pocket-sized refusal to admit that the age of steam might soon boil over. You glance again at the man across from you. He's blowing gently across his cup, a faint smile curling under his mustache. Outside, the countryside blurs into watercolor greens and browns. Inside, the air smells faintly of bergamot and bravery. He raises the cup slightly in your direction, a silent toast to composure, and you realize he isn't just drinking tea. He's defending civilization itself, one sip at a time. A moment later, the train rounds a bend, and a plume of steam sweeps past the window like a sigh. The wheels click rhythmically beneath you, steady, hypnotic, and you start to see it, the fragile beauty of the ritual. In an era obsessed with progress, the simple act of brewing tea by hand, with flame and patience, was an act of rebellion, a reminder that not everything should move faster. Outside the compartment, a porter clatters by, shouting something about misplaced luggage. Someone's hatbox tumbles into the aisle. The gentleman beside you doesn't flinch. He adds another lump of sugar, stirs slowly, and takes another sip. His world remains intact. And in that gentle defiance, you sense the first whisper of the story that will unfold over the next few hours. How a nation on rails held itself together with porcelain and patience. How comfort became culture. And how the sound of tea being poured could drown out even the roar of industry. The whistle blows again, long and low, and you lean back, lulled by the rhythm, feeling the warmth of invisible steam rise from your own imaginary cup. Because tonight, you're not just watching history, you're traveling inside it, The train's wheels hum beneath you like a lullaby made of iron and smoke. Outside the window, the fields stretch into mist, the hedgerows blurring into an impressionist smear of greens and grays. You adjust yourself in the seat, watching your reflection flicker in the glass, half modern traveler, half ghost of an Edwardian passenger. And you realize how strange it must have felt to be alive in that moment. Everything was changing: fashion, speed, manners, and yet one thing refused to be left behind: tea. The story of the portable tea set begins, fittingly, in a drawing room filled with lace and complaint. Picture a lady of respectable means, corseted, gloved, and mildly furious. She's just returned from a train journey to the coast where, horror of horrors, the refreshment room at Clapham Junction ran out of milk. Her maid suggests she might have some tea pre-prepared next time. The lady, scandalized, replies that cold tea is an offense against both God and empire. And so the seed is planted. If one cannot find tea fit to drink, one must bring civilization with oneself. That impulse, half vanity, half ingenuity, birthed an entire cottage industry. By the 1890s, advertisements for travel tea sets began appearing in glossy catalogues from Harrods, Asprey, and Liberty's. They promised refined refreshment at any distance. The sets were exquisite miniatures of domestic order, tiny teapots of silver plate or brass, dinky sugar tongs, spoons the size of a child's thumb. There were versions for every class, cheap tin models for the middle classes, mahogany boxed marvels for the elite. Some even folded into one another like Russian dolls, the whole contraption no larger than a lunch pail. You can imagine yourself owning one. It's early morning and you're catching the 9:10 to Bath. Your porter carries your luggage while you clutch your pride and joy. A walnut case bound with brass corners. When you open it, it gleams like treasure. One burner, one pot, 2 cups, a tiny container of condensed milk sealed with wax. You feel absurdly accomplished, like a commander about to perform. A sacred campaign of civility, mainstream. Historians will tell you that Britain's global obsession with tea, fueled by imperial trade routes and colonial plantations, naturally spilled into travel culture. It was more than habit. It was identity. Tea meant stability, empire, and grace under pressure. When trains disrupted time itself, collapsing long distances into short journeys, Britons needed something familiar to cling to. So they carried the one ritual that still felt unshakably British: boil, steep, sip, repeat. But there's a quirkier truth beneath that polished surface. The first miniature tea kits weren't designed for trains at all. They were made for military officers and explorers. Campaign sets from the mid-19th century featured collapsible cups and alcohol burners, meant for the far reaches of India or Africa. The Edwardians simply borrowed the idea and replaced khaki with velvet. Civilization, it seemed, could now be waged on rail lines instead of battlefields. Of course, as with all things Edwardian, style mattered as much as function. These travel sets were not just tools, they were trophies. Society magazines described them in loving detail. Miss Davenport's traveling tea case of silver gilt and mother of pearl, or the Duchess of Roxby's enamel service, decorated with violets. They were the smartphones of their time, status symbols that whispered taste and discretion. Some were fitted with mirrors, others with hidden compartments for biscuits or brandy. Because, let's be honest, not every tea was purely tea. Historians still argue whether this fixation on aesthetic refinement represented a progressive embrace of design or a collective case of pre-war denial. Britain, after all, stood atop a teetering empire. While rail lines connected the countryside, cracks were forming across continents. Yet in carriages scented with bergamot, passengers convinced themselves that civilization could be condensed into porcelain and silver. You pour yourself an imaginary cup as the story rattles forward. The carriage rocks. The teaspoon trembles slightly in the saucer. Someone down the corridor coughs. Another laughs softly. And for a moment, you're part of a grand choreography. Hundreds of passengers performing their personal rituals of control against the chaos of speed. There were practical reasons, too. Railway refreshments were notoriously unreliable. Buffets at stations often served lukewarm tea brewed in vats, so overused they tasted of tin. A letter from a traveler in 1906 describes a substance of uncertain hue, resembling weak broth, offered under the guise of tea. The horror. For the refined traveler, such indignity could not stand. Better to bring your own teapot and the assurance of quality. Then there was the matter of hygiene. Industrial Britain was filthy. Soot in the air, smoke in your hair, microbes on everything. Public cups were shared by hundreds. Germ theory was still new, and people were terrified of railway miasma. Carrying your own cup wasn't just polite, it was self-defense. In fact, one health and home pamphlet of 1909 recommended personal drinking vessels for railway travel, warning that one sip may convey contagion. Suddenly, that dainty teacup doesn't look so frivolous. It's practically medical equipment. You can almost hear the advertisement selling peace of mind. Avoid the perils of public utensils, one read. Carry your comfort, your cleanliness, and your calm. It sounds absurdly modern, like a 1900s infomercial for travel mugs, but it worked. Sales soared. Even soldiers heading to the Boer War packed miniature tea tins. Even factory girls carried enamel cups on excursions. The act of brewing became democratic, an empire of tea extending from duchesses to dock workers. But for all their pomp, these sets were also fragile. Porcelain shattered, brass dented, and spirit burners leaked. There are accounts of passengers setting fire to their luggage, trying to light the kettle during a stop. One diary entry recounts a gentleman's despair when his sugar pot melted during a particularly long delay near Swindon. "My composure perished with it," he wrote. A line that perfectly sums up the Edwardian soul. Quirky scholars love to point out the psychological angle. Miniature tea sets provided control in a world that suddenly felt uncontrollable. You couldn't predict when your train would arrive or whether the empire would survive, but you could decide when to pour, how long to steep, how sweet to make it. Every cup was a small rebellion against uncertainty. And as you imagine yourself performing that ritual, boiling, steeping, sipping, you realize how sensually detailed it was. The hiss of the flame, the faint perfume of the leaves, the warmth blooming through the porcelain into your fingers. It's soothing, rhythmic, almost hypnotic. In that confined, clattering world, tea was meditation before mindfulness had a name. Outside the window, dusk gathers. The train plunges through a tunnel, and for a moment, everything is pitch black except the ember glow from your companion's kettle. You can see his face lit by it, calm, focused, ritualistic. Maybe that's what people really carried with them, not just tea sets, but small islands of serenity. As the train emerges into the open air, a mist of steam and rain mixes with moonlight. The compartment smells faintly of metal, smoke, and comfort. The gentleman beside you wipes the rim of his teacup with a handkerchief embroidered with his initials. He does it not because it's necessary, but because it's tradition. The motion is muscle memory, a spell to keep chaos away. You take another imaginary sip, the warmth spreading softly down your throat, and for the first time, you understand why no Edwardian traveler dared leave home without a miniature tea set. It wasn't luxury, it was identity, condensed, brewed, and poured into porcelain. The train sways gently like a cradle for grown-ups who refuse to admit they need lullabies. And somewhere in that rhythm, you drift from curiosity into quiet empathy for a world that built its comfort one teaspoon at a time. The rhythm of the train deepens as dusk settles, each clack and rattle like a heartbeat under your seat. You can almost feel the Edwardian countryside breathing beyond the window, smoke rising from cottages, a dog barking faintly in the distance, the last light glinting on wet rails. Inside the compartment, everything feels strangely private yet public, like a tiny stage where etiquette performs itself over and over. And here's where the drama of appearances begins. Because in Edwardian rail travel, it wasn't just about drinking tea. It was about how you drank it, when and who saw you do it. You pour your imaginary cup again. But this time you notice the choreography, the careful lifting of the saucer, the precise angle of the wrist, the quiet clink as the teaspoon touches the rim. Tiny gestures that once carried the weight of class distinction. In an age obsessed with decorum, etiquette was performance art, and every train carriage doubled as a stage. Mainstream historians often call the Edwardian period the last age of manners. Even on a train, there were invisible hierarchies at play. First-class passengers had compartments with velvet cushions and attendants who could fetch boiling water. Second-class travelers, shopkeepers, clerks, respectable ladies, might carry their own provisions and kits. Third-class passengers were lucky to get a draft-free corner. And yet everyone aspired upward. A middle-class woman with a neat tea set could appear refined, no matter how sooty her gloves. That was the quiet power of the miniature tea set, a passport into dignity. Quirky. Cultural historians point out that Edwardians believed propriety could be portable. You didn't need a mansion to have manners. You just needed the right props. The portable tea set, in its tiny perfection, let people act aristocratic anywhere. You might be wedged between a farmer and a salesman, but if you could pour gracefully and avoid slurping, you were spiritually first class. Historians still argue whether this obsession was endearing or pathological. Some say it was a beautiful democratization of refinement. Others think it was social anxiety in a tin box. After all, the Edwardian middle class was terrified of doing the wrong thing in public. The rise of mass transport meant being constantly visible to strangers, a moving audience ready to judge your every motion. Tea etiquette became a survival skill, a way to say, "Don't worry, I belong here." You can feel that tension in the air as the train clatters through the dark. Across from you, a young woman in a pale coat opens her own travel set. She moves carefully, conscious of eyes. She pours with a slight tremor in her wrist, glances up, smiles faintly. Somewhere, her mother's voice echoes in memory. "Don't tilt the cup too high. Don't gulp. Don't spill. The cup trembles anyway." The train hits a rough patch of track, and a single drop of tea splashes onto her glove. You can almost hear her heartbeat quicken. In this small mishap lies an entire century's worth of pressure. To appear calm, perfect, unshaken. She dabs the stain quickly, reclaims her poise, and takes a sip as if nothing happened. Civilization crisis averted. There's a strange comedy in it all, and you can't help smiling. The Edwardians built rules for everything. How to stir, clockwise, quietly. How to sip. No lip marks. And even how to refuse an offered biscuit without offense, "No, thank you, I am perfectly content." These rituals traveled everywhere. Onto ships, into offices, and yes, into train compartments clattering through the night. Some train companies tried to codify etiquette further. The Great Western Railway Handbook for Passengers, circa 1910, gently reminded travelers that the taking of refreshment should be discreet and without undue display. Translation: don't look greedy. But people ignored it anyway. Tea had power and nobody gave it up easily. Still, for every rule there was rebellion. Some passengers turned the ritual into gentle satire. Journalists mocked the tea-brewing ladies of the London to Brighton line, claiming they formed a kind of rolling social club. Young bohemians even began mocking etiquette manuals, creating anarchic tea parties where spoons were deliberately mismatched and milk was poured before tea. Scandalous. The tea set became a prop not just for propriety but for irony. But the tension between appearances and authenticity ran deep. Britain was teetering between old-world elegance and modern disorder. The train itself symbolized this paradox. Machinery roaring beneath layers of lace and civility. You could hear the hiss of steam mixing with the rustle of skirts, the smell of oil mingling with perfume. Tea bridged that divide. It let people carry the illusion of home into motion, of calm into chaos. You glance around the compartment again. A gentleman reads the Times, pretending not to notice that his mustache has collected soot. An elderly woman carefully rewraps her teapot in a crocheted cozy, as if tucking a child into bed. A boy in short trousers stares, fascinated by the ritual, already learning what it means to be proper. These are small acts, but they form the invisible architecture of Edwardian life. Even the railway companies knew the symbolism. Some began designing special compartments for ladies' refreshment, complete with mirrors, folding tables, and discreet hooks for tea kits. The Northeastern Railway famously advertised comforts for the genteel traveler, including compartments suitable for taking one's own luncheon. They knew that civility sold tickets, and yet, underneath all this grace, something deeper was stirring. Industrial Britain was growing restless. Class lines were blurring, women were demanding rights, and the empire's shine was beginning to tarnish. The tea set, delicate, fragile, exquisitely unnecessary, was the perfect metaphor for a society balancing on the edge of change. You sip again and think, how strange that a few ounces of porcelain could carry so much meaning. The ritual wasn't just about taste or temperature. It was about identity maintenance. When the world shook, people held their cups steady. Quirky museum records even tell of travelers who refused to board a train without their set. One aristocrat reportedly turned back from Paddington because her maid forgot the teaspoons. Another insisted on unpacking her tea case during a 6-minute stopover for the sake of order. There's a fine line between devotion and obsession, and Edwardians loved walking it in heels. Outside, rain begins to patter on the window. Soft, rhythmic, timeless. You can almost hear the droplets sinking with the train's steady rumble. The carriage smells faintly of damp wool and bergamot. Somewhere down the corridor a kettle whistles. And for a moment, all those people, rich or poor, composed or panicked, are united in the same quiet ritual. Pour, stir, sip. The young woman with the trembling hand looks calmer now. Her cup empty, she folds her napkin precisely in half, tucks it back into the box, and clasps it shut with a tiny click. You can almost hear her exhale. The set isn't just an accessory, it's her portable sanctuary, and as the train barrels onward through the dark, you realize something subtle but profound. Civilization isn't a place, it's a posture, It's the ability to remain calm while the world rocks and roars around you. The Edwardians may have carried tea sets for manners, but what they were really carrying was courage. The carriage grows quieter as the night deepens. You can feel the subtle shudder of steel beneath you, the rhythmic heave of pistons pushing you forward through the darkness. The gas lamps flicker slightly overhead, painting everyone's faces in a warm, buttery glow. You're no longer simply watching Edwardian passengers perform their elegant rituals. You're beginning to understand the practical sorcery behind them. Because, as you'll soon learn, brewing tea on a moving train wasn't as graceful as it looked. It was equal parts innovation, improvisation, and insanity. You glance across at a man fiddling with what looks like a tiny chemistry set. A brass burner, a squat kettle, and a bottle labeled methylated spirits. He looks suspiciously confident, like someone who's done this far too often. You watch him unfold a collapsible tripod stand, balance the kettle, and strike a match. A blue flame flickers to life, hissing like a polite demon. The compartment fills with the faint scent of alcohol and ambition. Welcome to the age of portable pyrotechnics in the name of. Tea mainstream historians usually focus on the cultural symbolism of Edwardian tea drinking, but the technology behind it was equally fascinating and frequently ridiculous. Spirit burners, patented railway teapots, and foldable kettles were all attempts to solve a single problem: how to boil water safely in a rattling metal box filled with flammable upholstery. One particularly popular model, the Bullpit's patent railway kettle, came with a self-contained burner and a whistle that shrieked once the water reached temperature. Unfortunately, it also had a tendency to leak spirits and ignite the surrounding luggage. Newspapers occasionally reported minor conflagrations aboard express trains, always described with alarming nonchalance. A small fire was quickly subdued. One account from 1908 read, "The one gentleman's hat was entirely lost. There's something delightfully absurd about it." The same nation that built precision, locomotives capable of spanning, empires also thought it wise to let passengers light small fires beside velvet seats. But that's the Edwardian paradox: progress wrapped in lace. Quirky collectors today still find these little contraptions in antique shops. Burners shaped like acorns, kettles engraved with vines, even tiny samovars imported from Russia. The samovar craze deserves its own moment. By 1905, thanks to cross-continental rail networks, Russian-style tea brewing had reached English travelers. Some enthusiasts carried pocket samovars, miniature urns with internal chimneys for charcoal. Yes, charcoal on a train. The Edwardians somehow combined pyromania with etiquette and called it taking refreshment. You can picture it: smoke curling up through the compartment, a faint panic among passengers, someone insisting, "It's quite all right, it's for the tea." One poor man reportedly tried to heat his kettle with a candle, only to melt the wax all over his trousers. The papers dubbed him the Molten Gentleman. History, alas, did not record his opinion on the matter, but behind the humor there was genuine ingenuity. Portable heat sources became small marvels of design. Spirit burners had adjustable vents, kettles featured folding spouts, and some tea sets included clamps to secure them to the seat so they wouldn't tip during sudden stops. It was Victorian engineering, scaled down to dollhouse size, fueled by caffeine and national pride. Still, brewing tea in motion required focus. Imagine balancing a pot of near-boiling water as the train jolts over uneven rails. One wrong sway, and you've baptized your lap in scalding Earl Grey. There are diary entries describing these near misses with both horror and humor. One lady traveling to Devon wrote that she suffered a most unfortunate infusion of lapsang upon my corset, the scent of which lingered unbecomingly until Bristol. Historians still argue whether the ritual was worth the risk. Some claim it represented the height of British fortitude, an act of sheer will against physics. Others suspect it was more about showing off. After all, what better way to demonstrate elegance under pressure than to brew tea while hurtling through the countryside at 40 miles per hour? Your companion's kettle now emits a faint whistle. He extinguishes the flame with practiced ease, pours water over his tea leaves, and waits precisely 2 minutes, no more, no less. The sound of metal cooling mingles with the rhythmic clatter of the rails. It's strangely soothing. You realize how sensory the ritual was. The hiss of steam, the aroma of black tea cutting through coal smoke, the soft chime of spoon against porcelain. It was a symphony of control in an age obsessed with speed. For Edwardians, those sensations meant comfort, even when surrounded by industrial noise. The tea set was both technology and therapy, a way to remind oneself that progress didn't have to erase gentleness. Not everyone, however, was so graceful. Some passengers brought contraptions better suited to laboratories than leisure. A journalist in the Strand magazine once described witnessing a gentleman erecting what appeared to be a small engine within his compartment. It turned out to be a tea brewing device with a built-in pump and pressure valve. The man nearly blew the window out, and yet amid these eccentric inventions, there were quiet triumphs. The thermos flask, patented in 1904, changed everything. At last, travelers could carry hot water without playing with fire. Suddenly, tea became safer, more discreet, and, some would argue, less heroic. Old-fashioned purists sneered at the thermos. "No true infusion," sniffed one reviewer in the Ladies' Pictorial, "can result from water that is not freshly boiled." To them, instant heat meant instant decline. The romance of danger was part of the charm. You sip again, and it's easy to sympathize. There's something hypnotic about the way Edwardians balanced peril and poise. They carried matches, methylated spirits, fragile porcelain, and lace gloves, all in the same bag, and somehow believed civilization depended on this balance. Maybe it did, because each tea set was a microcosm of the Edwardian world, beautiful, ingenious, and on the brink of combustion. Outside, the train passes a signal box glowing red in the mist. Inside, the gentleman's kettle steams quietly. You watch him pour with the steady hand of a surgeon, never spilling a drop. He offers you a cup, a small gesture but filled with pride. You take it, feel the warmth through the porcelain, and realize that this, right here, is what they were protecting. A fragment of peace in a century about to lose its innocence. The air smells of bergamot and smoke. Somewhere, a baby cries in another carriage. A guard's whistle echoes faintly down the corridor. The gentleman packs his set away, each piece wrapped in cloth, each motion deliberate. It's as if by preserving this ritual, he's preserving the order of his world. You lean back, the train rocking gently, and think about how many such cups were brewed across a restless empire, each one a tiny declaration that grace could coexist with grit, that even amid steam, soot, and speed, refinement could still hold the line. And as the whistle cries into the night, you feel the train gather momentum beneath you. The world outside may be rushing forward, but inside this carriage, time has slowed to the pace of a careful pour. By morning, the world outside the carriage has shifted. The darkness that once pressed against the windows has dissolved into a pale gray dawn, streaked with mist and chimney smoke. The train slows slightly, the rhythmic clang of the rails softening into a tired hum. Passengers begin to stir, yawns hidden behind gloved hands, coats adjusted, hairpins fixed. The day is waking, and with it, the eternal question arises once more. Who will brew the first tea of the morning? You glance down the corridor. The compartment that was silent hours ago now hums with a quiet choreography of ritual. A mother unwraps a tin of biscuits. An older gentleman retrieves a folded newspaper. A young woman opens a wicker case the size of a small altar. Inside gleam rows of silver spoons, a porcelain teapot wrapped in linen, and a jar of loose-leaf Darjeeling. The act of unpacking looks ceremonial, as if she's laying out relics rather than utensils. There's a reverence in these gestures. In Edwardian travel culture, tea wasn't a pause, it was a restoration. The empire may have spanned continents, but the measure of civilization was still defined by the calm within a teacup. On trains that thundered across industrial England or through the misty Scottish Highlands, tea was the tether between motion and memory. Observers at the time wrote about this almost spiritual dimension. A 1910 travel diary by one Clara Denning notes, "The train carried us like a bullet, yet our hands remained steady upon the cup. It is the English soul, I think, never spilling, even when the world itself trembles." She might have been exaggerating, but she wasn't wrong. For Edwardians, tea meant more than warmth. It meant continuity. The whistle could scream, the carriage could sway, but the liquid in that cup, calm, amber, and fragrant, stood as a defiant little miracle of stability. And yet, stability was becoming harder to find. By 1910, the world outside those carriage windows was transforming at an alarming pace. Factories multiplied, empires strained, and politics brewed storms far fiercer than any tempest in a teapot. The people in this train, genteel, composed, beautifully dressed, were unknowingly traveling toward the precipice of modernity. Within 4 years, many of these same routes would carry soldiers instead of silk travelers. Perhaps that's why the ritual of tea became almost sacred, a pocket of civility before the chaos. Letters from Edwardian soldiers later recalled the comfort of those memories. The sound of a kettle, the faint perfume of Earl Grey. To them, it was nostalgia distilled, a fragment of a gentler century that had vanished too quickly. But back to the carriage. The young woman with the wicker case pours her tea with measured grace, steam curling around her face. She offers a cup to the gentleman beside her, who accepts it with a bow of thanks. They don't speak. They don't need to. The moment itself speaks, quietly and completely. It's in this silence that you realize something deeper. The entire Edwardian tea ritual was a language of manners, a form of unspoken communication. Every motion, from how one lifted the lid to how one stirred without clinking, was encoded with meaning. The way you handled your teacup could reveal class, confidence, and even your emotional state. There were manuals devoted to it, some almost absurdly detailed. One guide from 1908 warned, "To slurp, however discreetly, is to betray rustic origins. To leave one spoon in the cup is the mark of a savage." Another offered the delightful admonition, "Should your train jostle your wrist, pretend it was intended. Elegance is, after all, the art of concealment." You can almost imagine the Edwardians taking that advice seriously. In an era obsessed with decorum, grace was a survival mechanism. The train could sway, the empire could crack, but one must never spill the tea. The paradox, of course, is that beneath all this refinement was a restless hunger for progress. Tea may have symbolized serenity, but its leaves came from plantations half a world away, from the hills of Ceylon, Sri Lanka, the valleys of Assam, India, and the terraces of Fujian, China. Each sip in that fragile porcelain cup was connected to invisible hands, to laborers, traders, and sailors who never saw these velvet-lined compartments. That uncomfortable truth wasn't often discussed, not over scones and strawberry preserves, but it lingered quietly in the scent of the leaves. The Edwardian tea ritual was both beautiful and brittle, civilized and complicit. It contained within it the contradictions of an empire at its zenith, poised, elegant, and fatally unaware of its own fragility. You take another sip, and it tastes like history, warm, fragrant, and faintly ironic. Outside the window, the train passes through a landscape slowly gilded by morning light. Farmlands roll by, hedgerows dotted with sheep, thin smoke rising from chimneys, a boy waving from a distant field. The world feels timeless, but you know it isn't. The age that built this beauty was already crumbling at the edges. The tea, for all its ritual, was a way to keep pretending that nothing would change. Inside the carriage, the rhythm of teaspoons resumes. A faint smile crosses your face. You realize that every generation has its tea, its chosen ritual of calm amid the noise. For the Edwardians, it was a pot balanced on a burner at 40 miles an hour. For you, perhaps, it's this story, unfolding softly as the train clatters on. The cup is nearly empty now. A final drop trembles at the rim, catching the morning light like amber. You raise it, sip, and let it linger. That perfect blend of warmth, nostalgia, and bittersweet memory. And as the train glides toward its next station, the whistle echoing through the hills, one truth remains steady across the centuries. Civilization, in all its noise and glory, still pauses for tea. The train gains speed again, the countryside peeling away like a long ribbon of green and soot. The rhythm beneath your feet is steady now, hypnotic, as if the whole of England has fallen into sync with the hum of the rails. Somewhere ahead, the dining car rattles faintly, smelling faintly of bacon fat and boiled cabbage, the supposed modern solution to the nation's tea obsession. You rise, stretching your legs, and wander toward it. The corridor sways gently with the train's motion, and as you pass compartments, you notice the contrasts. Here, a family laughing over homemade sandwiches. There, a businessman scribbling notes on a timetable. And farther down, a woman staring absently out the window, a silver teaspoon twirling between her fingers. All of them part of this grand moving machine, yet all of them craving one small, familiar comfort. The dining car doors swing open with a squeal. You step into the clatter of cutlery and the faint hiss of the samovar in the corner. A waiter in a crisp white jacket approaches, his expression carefully neutral. The way service staff were trained to look when dealing with the anxious upper class. "Tea?" he asks flatly, as if it's not the most sacred word in the Edwardian language. You nod. He disappears, and soon enough a delicate china cup lands in front of you. The tea is hot, but it's not the same. It tastes of machinery, of convenience, of standardization. The charm of ritual is missing. The tiny imperfections that made home-brewed tea so human, a bit too strong, a drop too sweet, a spoonful of personality, have been replaced by efficiency. And that, as it turns out, was one of the great debates of the Edwardian railway age. Should passengers bring their own civility, or should the railway provide it? Historians still argue whether this tension between private ritual and public comfort marked the beginning of modern consumer culture. On one hand, the railway companies wanted to project refinement: white tablecloths, imported china, printed menus boasting Ceylon's finest. On the other, passengers didn't trust mass hospitality. It was too impersonal, too uniform. To an Edwardian traveler, a cup of tea brewed by someone else felt faintly indecent, almost lazy, as if one had surrendered one's manners to a machine. One railway pamphlet from 1909 even mocked this sentiment. Why, good sir, should the lady burden herself with a spirit lamp when the company offers her the finest refreshment car in Europe? To which a letter to the Times promptly replied, because the company's tea tastes like despair. The battle lines were drawn. Homemade decency versus corporate civility. The miniature tea set became a quiet protest, a portable declaration that good taste could not be standardized. It was the Edwardian equivalent of bringing your own headphones to a party, a polite refusal to submit to someone else's idea of pleasure. And so passengers continued to pack their silver flasks and porcelain cups. Some even smuggled their own cream in tiny glass bottles wrapped in cloth. The wealthier sort commissioned custom leather cases, embossed with initials and lined with velvet, so that their tea gear looked more like jewelry than cookware. You can almost imagine the small mountain of luggage, hat boxes, parasols, walking sticks, and tucked somewhere within, a case containing the most British thing imaginable: independent civility. But as with all things Edwardian, this too began to change. The world outside was moving faster, literally and metaphorically. Trains began to pick up speed, reducing the time one could spend dawdling over tea. Dining cars grew more popular, and the experience, once so intimate and fussy, started to industrialize. The irony is sharp. The same trains that carried the empire's luxury goods also carried the seeds of its undoing. Speed, once thrilling, became the enemy of ritual. Still, some passengers resisted. One 1911 article in the Ladies' Realm advised readers on how to preserve grace when the world moves too fast. Its author suggested the traveler's tea as an anchor of poise, reminding readers that even amid the roar of industry, one may brew gentility. You imagine that advice resonating with countless women, especially those navigating the increasingly public, male-dominated spaces of travel. The tea set, in that sense, wasn't merely about caffeine, it was about agency. It allowed women to create a small, controlled space in an otherwise mechanical world. That act, heating water, pouring, stirring, became a quiet assertion of autonomy. There's something almost rebellious about that, isn't there? The act of making tea on a moving train wasn't just dainty, it was defiant. The carriages might tremble, the timetable might rule all, but here was one domain untouched by industry's rush. A cup of calm you brewed yourself. The waiter clears your cup, glancing at the miniature set on the table beside you. Perhaps a relic someone left behind. It gleams faintly in the morning light. Silver edges, a hinge slightly bent, a faint whiff of bergamot when the lid opens. You can see your reflection in it, stretched, warped, almost ghostly, like a shadow of history peering back. There's a charm in imagining how many lives pass through that small set. Lovers sharing glances over it. Soldiers returning home clutching it in their kit bags. Children staring wide-eyed as their mothers carefully poured, warning them never to slosh. Each moment a fragment of a larger, gentler world that couldn't quite survive the century ahead. Because while tea culture persisted, the meaning of it changed. The First World War broke that polished surface. The Empire's steel trains began to carry wounded men instead of dainty luggage, and tea became a comfort ration rather than a social performance. The miniature sets disappeared into cupboards, then attics, then museums. Yet somehow the ritual remained, adapted, simplified, democratized, By the 1920s, you could buy railway flasks at department stores, pre-filled with tea, wrapped in leather, marketed to the new commuter class. What was once an emblem of elegance became a symbol of practicality. And still, that thread, that yearning for calm, for something warm and fragrant amid the noise, never broke. You sip the last of your railway tea, bitter but hot, and smile at the irony. Technology won, but only barely. For even now, as the train barrels through the landscape, passengers across time continue to reach for the same comfort. A cup, a pause, a moment of sanity. Historians still argue whether the Edwardians were hopelessly nostalgic or beautifully human, maybe both. But there's a strange comfort in knowing that their miniature tea sets weren't just about etiquette. They were a kind of armor against noise, against speed, against change. You glance again at the silver set beside you. The train jolts and it rattles faintly, a small trembling echo of the past. You steady it instinctively, because some things you realize should never spill. The train has rolled into the heart of mid-morning now, sunlight flashing in the brass fixtures and flickering off the window panes. The carriage smells faintly of coal and lavender water, and everyone seems settled into that peculiar Edwardian rhythm, half leisure, half alert composure. But the peace, as always, is fragile, for wherever tea and manners meet, scandal usually finds its way in. You're sitting quietly, watching the reflections tremble across the glass, when a sudden clatter draws your attention. 3 compartments down, someone's teacup has just met a tragic end. A delicate piece of porcelain now lies shattered in 6 mournful shards across the floor. There's a collective gasp, the kind reserved for opera mishaps and wardrobe malfunctions, followed by the flutter of handkerchiefs and sympathy murmurs. The owner, a dapper gentleman with a beard sharp enough to slice bread, sighs heavily. "Imported from Vienna," he mutters. You almost expect a priest to appear and perform last rites for the cup. This, you realize, is the other side of Edwardian refinement. A culture so obsessed with appearances that even a minor spill feels like social disaster. Within minutes, the incident becomes public property. You hear whispers traveling faster than the train itself about how the gentleman must be nouveau riche, how no true aristocrat would weep over crockery, how the sound of breaking porcelain reveals the fragility of breeding. You can't help but smirk. Human nature, it seems, has never needed Wi-Fi to gossip efficiently. And yet, beneath the snickers lies something fascinating, the moral theater of travel. In Edwardian society, every shared space became a stage on which behavior was silently judged. Tea, of all things, turned into a performance of control, generosity, and subtle flirtation. Take, for instance, the famous railway flirt. This was a recognized phenomenon, documented and mildly condemned in etiquette manuals of the era. 2 strangers might share a table in a first-class compartment. He offers to pour. She hesitates, then allows it. A small spill, a laugh, a napkin exchange. And just like that, an entire courtship blooms in the time between York and King's Cross. One particularly prim magazine warned that passing sugar between strangers invites familiarity of the most dangerous kind, which, to be honest, sounds like the Edwardian equivalent of don't share your Spotify playlist too soon. Tea, in those cramped carriages, could be both shield and signal. The miniature tea set became an accessory of identity. Yours was engraved, you were old money, enamel with floral print, probably new money, pewter, likely middle class, tasteful but practical, and heaven forbid anyone see a crack in the teapot lid. That would be tantamount to revealing a crack in your family tree. You lean back, amused, watching as another passenger discreetly unwraps her own compact tea kit. Ivory handle, gilt spout, a spoon so polished you could shave in it. She notices your glance and offers a knowing smile. That's the unspoken bond of travelers. Those who carry their own tea are part of a secret fellowship of self-sufficiency and subtle rebellion. Historians still argue whether these miniature tea sets were purely functional or fashion statements first. Some claim they were born from genuine necessity. Trains lacked consistent refreshment service, so travelers adapted. Others insist the sets evolved into status symbols, a kind of genteel flex before flexing became digital. Either way, their presence turned every compartment into a portable drawing room, and every passenger into a tiny ambassador of civilization. But not every tale of tea and travel ended elegantly. Scandals brewed, sometimes literally. There's a well-circulated anecdote about a duchess who accidentally spilled boiling water on an admiral's trousers while pouring in a jostling carriage. The incident made London papers under the headline, "Steam and Scandal at Paddington." Both parties denied impropriety, of course, but society enjoyed the story far more than their denials. Then there were the stolen spoons. A quiet epidemic of silver theft on the rails. Some passengers, particularly those of modest means but lofty ambitions, found it irresistible to pocket a teaspoon embossed with the railway crest. It became an inside joke among staff. The faster the train, the lighter the cutlery. Companies began discreetly engraving warnings on the underside. Property of GWR, return if found. Naturally, this only made them more collectible. The miniature tea set was both tool and temptation, a symbol of refinement and, occasionally, petty rebellion. Every scratch, every dent told a story. Some were heirlooms passed down through generations, others mementos from a honeymoon, others still trophies from journeys where the destination hardly mattered. You reach into your memory, or maybe imagination, and picture one particular set. A small mahogany box with brass hinges, lined with green velvet. Inside, a folding kettle. A cup thin as eggshell. A tiny tin marked Assam. The initials ED etched faintly on the lid. You imagine its owner, perhaps a young woman named Edith Davenport, a frequent traveler between Bath and London, who found comfort in brewing her own tea amid strangers. Each trip she'd take the same seat, pour the same blend, and gaze at her reflection in the window, wondering whether the world outside was moving too fast. These personal rituals stitched together the fabric of the age. In the vast machinery of empire and industry, tea provided something deeply human, a rhythm, a pause, a reminder of control. But like all rituals, it could also breed vanity. One 1912 caricature in Punch magazine depicted an entire railway car filled with passengers juggling teapots, cups, and sugar cubes, while a frazzled attendant shouted, "No room for tea sets or dignity." The cartoonist's jab was clear. Even in motion, the British couldn't abandon their obsession with ceremony. And yet, as you watch the passengers now, as spoons clink softly and sunlight pools on the table, you can't help admiring it. There's something tender about people insisting on small beauty amid the mechanical roar. The world outside is rushing, inventing, exploding into modernity. But inside, in this narrow carriage, someone still takes the time to measure the tea just so, to stir without noise, to offer you a biscuit with a quiet smile. You realize, not for the first time, that the miniature tea set was never about luxury. It was about preservation of manners, of self, of small joys in motion, a tiny rebellion against becoming part of the machinery. As the train barrels toward the next station, a bell rings for luncheon. Some passengers pack away their tea sets, wrapping porcelain in linen, tucking away spoons. Others linger, savoring the last drops. You hear laughter, low and easy, mixing with the clatter of wheels. For a fleeting moment, it feels like the world has found its perfect balance. Motion outside, stillness within. A final sip, a faint rattle, and the silver lid clicks shut. Another journey, another story steeped and finished. The afternoon sun has turned golden, spilling over the edges of the compartment windows like warm syrup. The train is quieter now. Conversations have softened, newspapers folded, and the rhythm of the wheels has become almost musical. The passengers look content, suspended between destinations, wrapped in that peculiar calm that comes from being in motion, but having nothing left to do. You look out the window and see the countryside slipping away, fields lined with hedgerows, a shepherd waving lazily at the passing train, and the glint of a church steeple in the distance. For a moment you can almost forget that time moves forward. The sound of a teaspoon tapping the rim of a cup brings you back. Small, familiar, human. That sound, that ritual, it's nearly gone now. By the late Edwardian years, just before the First World War, the miniature tea set began its quiet retreat from everyday travel. New trains were faster, their interiors sleeker, their rules stricter. Steam gave way to steel, and with that came a new kind of order, one that left no room for personal kettles or small burners. The same passengers who once brewed tea beneath their own parasols now found themselves served from uniform teapots stamped with company logos. Efficiency had won, but something intimate had been lost. You imagine one of those old passengers, perhaps our friend Edith Davenport, boarding a post-war train a decade later. She opens her travel case to find that her beloved miniature set feels outdated. People now buy their tea from vendors at stations, served in paper cups. No one carries sugar tongs anymore. The ritual, once so revered, feels faintly ridiculous to a generation shaped by war and rationing. So Edith leaves her tea set behind. Perhaps in a drawer, perhaps wrapped in tissue and placed on a mantel. Forgotten, but not unloved. Historians still argue whether the Edwardian tea ritual's demise marked progress or loss. Some say it was inevitable, that modernity demanded speed and uniformity. Others mourn it as the fading of a slower, more graceful world. The truth, perhaps, sits somewhere in the middle, much like the tea itself, balanced perfectly between bitter and sweet. You look around this train and see ghosts in every seat, echoes of that lost civility. The soft rustle of skirts, the faint scent of bergamot, the whisper of polite conversation. For all their vanity and excess, the Edwardians understood something we've almost forgotten: how to make time stand still. Even in the roaring belly of progress, they carved out moments of warmth, patience, and grace, one teacup at a time. The train whistles, long, low, final. The countryside blurs into twilight, and the light inside the carriage softens to amber. You can feel the day slipping away, just as that entire world once did. And maybe as you sit here, you realize that we've all been chasing the same thing ever since. That delicate balance between motion and stillness, between doing and simply being. The Edwardian travelers found it in tea. Perhaps we find it in the quiet moments before sleep, in stories like this one, in the soft hum of something familiar and kind. The miniature tea set may have vanished, but its lesson lingers. Beauty, no. matter how small, matters most when the world refuses to slow down. You close your eyes as the train rattles on, a lullaby of metal and memory. Somewhere deep in the carriage, someone pours the last cup of the day, steam rising like a sigh from another century. And as the world outside darkens, you find yourself smiling at a truth the Edwardians never needed to say aloud. No matter how far or fast we go, we all carry our own kind of tea set, our own fragile rituals of calm, tucked quietly inside. The rhythm of the train fades to a soft murmur now, as if it too has grown tired. The world beyond the window dissolves into deep blue, fields melting into night. You can almost hear the echo of a distant whistle, the breath of the steam, the faint clink of a spoon against porcelain. The sounds blend and stretch, slow and gentle, like the heartbeat of another time. Take a long breath here. Let it settle. Feel the weight of the day drift off your shoulders. Imagine yourself still seated in that quiet carriage, the cup warm in your hands, the air rich with the faint perfume of tea leaves and wood polish. The lamp above your head flickers softly, painting the world in gold. There's no hurry anymore. The train doesn't need to arrive. It can circle forever through this twilight countryside, past small villages, over starlit rivers, beneath wide sleeping skies. You are both passenger and dreamer now, part of this endless rhythm of wheels and whispers. If you listen closely, you might hear it. A voice from that age, calm and amused, reminding you that elegance was never about things. It was about how softly one could move through a noisy world. So let the train carry you a little longer. Let the sound of its motion wrap around you like a blanket. You are safe here, warm here, timeless here. The cup is empty, but the calm remains. Sweet dreams.